Howdy shipmates, it's Captain Dan here. Welcome to Story Time with Captain Dan, a time to tell tales, old and new, some classics, some funny, some serious, some sad perhaps, a real mixture of stories to share with you all during this time when we're all stuck at home together, for people young and old. And I've just received a special parcel, a special package with lots and lots of Ladybird Classic tales sent to me by my dear friend Deirdre, my Irish friend Deirdre, and her little friend, her little dog Molly. So today's story is specially dedicated to Deirdre, and it's an absolute classic, a Ladybird classic, The Elves and the Shoemaker. But I'm not just dedicating this special story to my friend Deirdre, I'm also dedicating it to another good friend of mine, Jonathan, and his two daughters, Philippa and Gabrielle. So here's The Elves and the Shoemaker for my friend Deirdre and her little dog Molly, but also for my friend Jonathan, and also for Jonathan's two daughters, Philippa and Gabrielle, who like stories by Captain Dan, I'm told. So here it is, The Elves and the Shoemaker. Story time with Captain Dan. Here we go. Oh, can't get my glasses on. I think the waters must be a bit choppy today. So The Elves and the Shoemaker. So once upon a time there lived a shoemaker and his wife. The man was a good shoemaker, and he worked really hard. Yet he and his poor wife, well, they were very poor. As time went on, they grew poorer and poorer. You can see them there. Oh dear. At last the day came when all the shoemaker had left was one piece of leather. He would make only one pair of shoes. That evening, before he went to bed, the shoemaker cut out a pair of shoes from the leather. Then he left them on his workbench, all ready for him to sew the next morning. As they were going upstairs to bed that night, the shoemaker spoke sadly to his wife. "I have used my last piece of leather," he said. "I have cut out one pair of shoes. Tomorrow I will sew them. When they are sewed, I do not know what will become of us." There you can see him and his wife and the shoes. Well, the next morning the shoemaker got up early and went into his workshop ready to make the shoes. But on his bench, instead of the leather he'd left cut out, he found a pair of shoes already made. He was astonished, and he didn't know what to think. What? The shoemaker took the shoes in his hands and looked carefully at them. They were neatly made with not one bad stitch on them. He showed the shoes to his wife, who said, "I have never seen a pair of shoes so well made. They are perfect," she said. The shoemaker and his wife could not think who had sewn the shoes. Well, that very same morning, a lady came into the shop to buy a pair of shoes. The shoemaker showed her the pair that he found on his bench. She said, "I have never seen such well-made shoes. Oh, wonderful," she said. The lady tried on the shoes and they fitted perfectly. She was so pleased with them that she paid the shoemaker twice the usual price. With the money, the shoemaker was able to buy leather for 2 more pairs of shoes. And that night before he went to bed, he cut out 2 pairs of shoes from that leather. He left them on the workbench, all ready to sew the next morning. Well, the next morning the shoemaker got up early and went into his shop to make the shoes. But he'd no need to do so. On his bench he found 2 pairs of shoes already made. He took the shoes in his hands and looked carefully at them. Once more he found that they were neatly made, with not one single bad stitch on them. That morning, a man came into the shop to buy some shoes. The shoemaker showed him the 2 pairs of shoes he'd found on the bench, and the man said, "I have never seen such well-made shoes. Marvellous," he said, "utterly marvellous." He was so pleased with them that he bought both pairs of shoes and paid the shoemaker twice the usual price. And so it went on. Every night the shoemaker cut out some leather, left it on his workbench. Every morning he found shoes all neatly made. Many rich customers came to his shop to buy these perfect shoes, so that in time the shoemaker and his wife, they became extremely rich. Now one evening, not long before Christmas, when the shoemaker had finished cutting out shoes, he went to his wife. "We still do not know who sews the shoes for us. Shall we stay up tonight to see who it is that helps us?" There you see them discussing it there. His wife thought that it was a very good idea, so she lit a candle and they went into the workshop. They hid themselves in the corner of the room. Then the shoemaker and his wife waited quietly and watched to see what would happen. Well, for a long time, nothing happened. Then, just as the clock struck midnight, the door on the workshop opened quietly. In came 2 tiny elves. They were dressed in old clothes and their feet were bare. They did not see the shoemaker and his wife, who were hiding in the corner watching them. The elves jumped onto the workbench and took up the shoes that had already been cut out. They began to stitch and sew and hammer. They worked so neatly and so quickly that the shoemaker could hardly believe his eyes. The elves did not stop for a moment until all the cut-out shoes were finished. Then they ran quickly away. The very next morning at breakfast, the shoemaker asked his wife, "How can we thank these little elves who have made us so rich and so happy?" "I know what we can do," said the wife. "We can make them new clothes and new shoes. Their own clothes are ragged and their feet are bare." You can see them having a hearty breakfast there. So during the evening that followed, the shoemaker and his wife began to make new clothes for the elves. The shoemaker chose the softest leather that he could find. He cut out 2 of the tiniest pairs of shoes that the world had ever seen. Then he stitched the shoes as carefully as he could. You can see that there, look. And the shoemaker's wife cut out 2 white shirts, 2 small green jackets, 2 pairs of trousers to match, and she sewed them with tiny stitches. Look at that. She made 2 tiny little caps, each with a feather in it. And she also knitted 2 pairs of tiny white stockings. There they are, look. By Christmas Eve, the tiny shoes and clothes were finished. Look at that. The shoemaker cleared the leather and the tools from his workbench. He and his wife laid their presents on the bench instead of doing their usual work. Then they hid themselves as they had done before and waited to see what the elves would do. Well, just as the clock struck midnight, the door opened quietly, just as it had done before. The 2 elves came running in. They still wore their old clothes and their feet were blue with cold. They jumped onto the bench, ready to get to work at once. But there was no leather on the bench, only the tiny clothes. The elves were astonished at first, and then they were delighted. In no time at all they were out of their tiny clothes. Then they dressed themselves in the beautiful new clothes, the green jackets and trousers, the white shirts and stockings, the soft leather shoes and little caps with feathers that nodded as they laughed. Then they joined hands and danced around, and as they danced they sang. "Now we are boys so fine to see, we need no cobblers be." At last they danced happily out of the door. And the shoemaker and his wife, they never saw the elves again. But from that time, good luck was always with them. They were rich and they were happy for the rest of their lives. So that's the end of a classic Ladybird Classic, The Elves and the Shoemaker, especially for my heroic friend Deirdre and her little dog Molly, who sent me a package in the post of several of these, and of course for my good friend Jonathan and his two daughters Philippa and Gabrielle, who are big fans, I understand, of Captain Dan. So that's the end of story time with Captain Dan for today. So I thank you all and I wish you well. I hope the seas stay calm for you as they do for me. But I'm going to wish you all a good night until we meet again. So, good night, good night. Oh, sweet repose. Don't lie on your belly, because you might squash your nose.